Good evening, welcome to this event at the Foundation for Science and Technology. Welcome to the people who are with us physically here at the Royal Society, and also welcome to our participants on Zoom. Thank you all very much indeed for coming on. We've got here an innovation in what's called cabaret-style seating. We'll see how it goes. I think it's partly because the previous event had seating like this, but we can try it out. And we're also continuing to innovate, because if you wish to find out where you are seating at dinner, use the QR code on the back of the program and you will be able to find out. Or you can text a teenager if you don't know how to do that. Anyway, so welcome for this event, which is really on such an important issue, net zero, UK and global progress, with, of course, the latest climate conference, COP28, due at the end of November, and a really powerful IPCC report making it clear we have already had global warming of 1.1 degrees, another very powerful wake-up call, and important reports as well from the Climate Change Committee. So we really do have an absolutely excellent team to focus on this, representing all the key organizations involved in advising on policy on all this. For people who are participating on Zoom, do start putting down your questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function. And of course, upvote questions that particularly strike you as significant, which helps us identify the key questions. But we'll also, of course, have questions from the people with us physically here tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Lord Deben, formerly John Gummer, who of course has served as chairman of the UK's Climate Change Committee from 2012 to 2023, where John really did make a fantastic impact. And before that, he was the UK's longest serving Secretary of State for the Environment, serving in that role from 1993 to 1997. John, thank you so much for opening up our discussion. We'll hear from you first and then from Professor Monks. John, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll just start by saying the Climate Change Committee produced a report, my last report, which in many ways was the sharpest one that we had put forward, because we felt it necessary to say that the current government is not on course for reaching net zero by 2050, nor is it on course to meet the internationally acclaimed targets which it fixed for 2030 and 2035. Of course, you don't say it in quite those terms. You say we are less certain than they are on course. But the truth of the matter is, any mathematician can see that they're not. And we know that because the courts, under the Climate Change Act, had required the government to explain how it was going to reach what are statutory demands. And the government produced a very large number of pages of explanation, which we didn't get in advance, as we always did on any other circumstance. We got it the day in which it was announced. It takes some time to read these documents, and by the time we got to the end of it, we were less satisfied than we had been when we started, because a number of things which we had given people the benefit of the doubt became very clearly there was no doubt. The fact of the matter is we're not on course. And that was before the Prime Minister's statement. Now, I've been in politics a long time, and I think I'm recognized as being fairly independent. And if I may say so, I know precisely where we are here. We are within a year, really, of a general election. And people do, I think, rather silly things then. And one of the things they do is to try to make a division when there isn't a division between themselves and their opposition. And in order to do that, it's not always very easy. I remember an election when Mr. Blair was signified by eyes that made him look like the devil. He manifestly was not an extremist, and that wasn't a terribly successful campaign. But we're now faced with a Prime Minister who says that he's not going to do a number of things. He's not going to have 7 bins in every home. I know of nobody who's ever suggested that. He's not going to have a tax on meat. Nobody has ever suggested that. He's not going to insist upon you carrying more people in your cars than you want to. Nobody has ever suggested that. So those things should not worry us. What should worry us is the belief that somehow or other we can reach net zero without anybody being upset in any circumstances. And there are a series of groups of people who are invented for this purpose. One of them is a favourite of the newspapers. He's called the motorist. Now, I know of nobody who defines themselves as a motorist, and I know that if I did know somebody who would define themselves as a motorist, he would be unlikely to be a bosom pal. The truth is that it is an invented concept, which is that we have to create circumstances in which people do not feel themselves imposed upon. And therefore we say, if we put the date back to 2035 for EVs, then nobody need worry, because they can still buy second-hand cars which are not EVs. They can still sell their cars that are not EVs. The thing you didn't mention was that was exactly the same if you had the date at 2030. There was no change whatsoever. And indeed, the demands on the industry remain the same. I go through that in some detail because I am very interested in the result and reaction of the industry. The companies that had done what they needed to do to meet what the government had insisted upon were furious. I think that the chairman of Ford put it exactly right. He said, we want governments which have ambition, commitment, and are always sticking to the things that they believe and have said they're going to stick to. They need to have consistency. Commitment, ambition, consistency. I'm afraid we don't have a government which has any of those 3 things in enough strength. But don't let's think that it is necessarily true that a change of government will be different. When the Labour Party very rightly said that it would not have long-term further expansion of exploitation and exploration in the North Sea, the first 2 organisations to attack it were their 2 biggest donors, the GMB and Unite. So don't let's kid ourselves. It's a tough world there, politically, to deliver net zero. And it's a tough world too, because all politicians are better at policy than delivery. We're not good at delivering, and it is delivery that the Climate Change Committee has been pressing about. And it's delivery that the courts are now considering, because, of course, under the Climate Change Act, this is a statutory requirement, and the government has to show to the courts that it has a policy and a programme. And it is no good the Prime Minister saying, we are going to meet net zero, when it's merely wishful thinking. Because if it were not true before he made his statements, it can hardly be likely to be true afterwards, although in the spirit of the Climate Change Committee, basing its statements only on the facts, on science, they are going to have another look at it to see what the effects of the Prime Minister's statements are. Now, I think all this is important because this is about UK and global progress. And I think we ought to recognise just what a contribution the United Kingdom has made towards global progress up to now, and why it was so important for the Climate Change Committee to say that it felt that Britain has now ceased to be the leader. Because what we have done is to set the targets which the world has begun to accept. It was we who first committed ourselves to net zero in 2050. It was we who set the best targets you could have set in the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. It is we who have said to the rest of the world, we've got to raise the money to help the developing countries to move from where they are to where they ought to be without the intervening and damaging dirty stage. British have got every reason to be proud of our history, not least the all-party agreement on climate change, invented by the Conservatives in opposition, won over with every other party, including the Protestant Unionists from the north of Ireland, a miracle, working its way through, and then the government accepting that it would have to take it on board because the Labour Party was determined to be part of this. So all-party commitment to the process which we have. And we've got now 15 or 16 nations that are following us because they see this structure as the best that we can have. So my message to you is, first, that we have done more than anyone else. And secondly, we are resiling, and that is unconscionable and unacceptable. And the third thing is to say that we have got to win back the battle. And that means winning the hearts and minds of people in Britain. It means making sure that we don't accept the Daily Mail's motorist as the person who is going to decide how we proceed. We have to bring back climate change into the democratic debate. And all of us here have got to help. Many of us here are not good at it, particularly the scientists. You will talk in a language which people don't understand. You don't get it to the places that people need to hear it. You still talk about kilowatt hours and don't talk about bills. We have to move the whole of the nation into an understanding that this has to be fought now, immediately, with urgency, and that it has to be fought in a way which leads the world instead of becoming tag-end Charlie. Just remember, the Americans have moved into a new place. The European Union, the rest of Europe, the place where we ought to be and foolishly left, they have moved into a new place. And China has announced the biggest move towards offshore wind, onshore wind, and photovoltaics of any time in history. It will meet its targets. And it has turned that into a business. That's why they're frightened about their cars. That's why we're frightened about their photovoltaics. They know where the future is. It's to fight the battle of climate change and to win the economic argument at the same time.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for setting the ball rolling. We're next going to hear from Professor Paul Monks, who is Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero. And of course, he has also served at the University of Leicester and remains a professor in atmospheric chemistry and Earth observation science at Leicester. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Lord Deben, for making my talk really, really hard. It's an absolute pleasure. So, but what I'm going to do is actually probably just be a wash-up act for the opening act there, and I'm going to present some of the data and some of the science that underpins some of the statements that John has just made as part of his introduction. So as I said, I'm Paul Monks, I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor. I'm really going to talk a little bit about the science that underpins this. John has said, of course, that I can't say kilowatt hour or megawatt hour or gigawatts or terawatts. I'm afraid there are some in there, so I'm very, very sorry about that. For me, though, the relationship between science and policy is summed up in this, and this is the challenge of net zero writ large. I took a picture of this at the door I was walking past at the university, and it's a great quote by a guy called H.L. Mencken, and he said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And for me, that is the challenge of net zero. It is a complex systems problem, and there aren't any simple answers out there. And actually, this is why it fills a room, and we get great debates in some respects, because that's the nature of that. As John said, we were the first country to legislate for net zero. We're actually one of the few in the world that still actually has a legislative on our legislative outcome on that. And in 2019, during the Theresa May government, the government upped its ambition to 100% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. So when we're talking about net zero, that's what we mean: net reduction of 100% compared to 1990 levels. And we do that through a series of carbon budgets, through the Climate Change Act, and we set the carbon budget 6, which was the mid-30s, and we're just beginning to think about carbon budget 7 as well. And the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, are the people that hold the government to account over this. It also feeds into the international process and the nationally determined contributions. And for example, we announced that during the COP26 process, the NDC for that. So what does this look like at the moment? Carbon Budget 6 set an ambition for 78%, I shouldn't say ambition because it's by law, isn't it? Set an outcome of 78% reduction by 2035. And the government laid out the science and the policies to do that in the net zero strategy that it published in 2021. There's been a number of other things going out. I think I joke on a yearly basis when I talk about this, and I was there when the net zero strategy is changed. And you would think that something like climate change, which is a long-term issue, it's about setting long-term solutions. And actually, every year, something market has changed that has changed our want and our need and the speed of change that we need to have around that. So I think that absolutely, I agree that speed of change and agility around this is important. I'll get to that back to that a little bit later in this. As John said, we have a good track record in the UK, one of the strongest track records globally with respect to decarbonisation around minus 48% since 1990 levels. But if you know anything about these sort of numbers, we need to go further than this to meet the goal of net zero by 2050. We need a greater rate of change than's on this graph. It's worth digging in a little bit one layer down to what really has driven those reductions and where many of those has come from. And you can clearly see there the sector that has most decarbonised, the biggest percentage of reduction is power, with fuel supply second. And you can see other sectors such as transport and buildings, which are much slower to decarbonise. And that gives you a flavour of where the challenges lie in the future with respect to net zero. I'm sorry, there is a terrible hour on here. So if we look at that and we look at the energy mixture that we need for the front, and I always say when I talk about this, we get kind of electricity and energy mixed up and we switch between those units quite freely. If you look at electricity, it's a great story. We have decarbonised. You see the growth of renewables. The last coal station is about to be turned off in the United Kingdom if it hasn't already been turned off around that. We're still quite dependent on imported gas. There's a growth of renewables and nuclear is an important part of that. But if we look at the amount of energy that we use, it's about 40-40-20. It's about 40% of the energy that we use in the United Kingdom is in transport, 40% is in heating, and about 20% is in electricity that we use now. And that lays out a challenge in some senses for the future, because much of that is going to become electricity. And actually, if we look to the future, we're going to double the amount of electricity probably that we need by 2050, and we need that to be low carbon. We need it to be 24/7 on back of renewables, and that is not an indistinct challenge, which I can debate until the flipping cows come home about what the system should look like. So it really does need that policy ambition, as John outlined, that delivery, and also, as he said, also that green investment as part of that. As I said, the NDC is 68% reduction by 2030, CB6 is 77 by 2035. The capital investment is going to need to be about 50 to 60 billion a year in order to achieve that as part of that. And we're looking at how to increase the rate of delivery of that and the science that underpins that. I think some general comments just kind of go away from that kind of background to where does science help us and what does science help us do. As I've already said, it's a systems problem. It is a systems problem, and you can tell this is a systems diagram because it's got lots of lines on it, and that makes it a systems diagram. But it actually tells you more than that. This is just the energy transition. It doesn't really matter what system it is. But actually what you can see on here is there's a technological change that's required, in this case, to decarbonise the electricity system. But that's also dependent on consumer behaviour and behaviour change. So this is a social problem as well as being a technical problem. And as John said, also you need finance to do that. So it's actually a social, a technical and an economic problem. So when we talk about this as a systems problem, it's a system of systems problem in the UK context, which is finance, economics, behaviour change and technical, socio-technical economic. And that sits in the global challenge of the global energy transition and the global economic transition. So I think remembering that this is a systems problem, not overcomplicating it and delivering it is important, not getting systems torpor as part of trying to deliver that, but recognising you've got the three legs of the stool here, the social, the economic and the technical is important. And if we just look at the social aspects of this and the green choices, if you look at Carbon Budget 6, 45% of those emission savings require the public to make green choices. And actually, these are different decarbonisation sectors in this graph at the top here, and in red is where green choices are required. So as John said, we do not think, and you cannot achieve this by a technocratic approach to net zero. You have to have a socio-technical economic approach as part of that. If we go back to the energy system, this begins to what it looks like. This is the system and what it looks like. And you're trying to work out what the correct mixture of production, storage, and use that delivers that. You've got the different flows within that energy system, hydrogen, electrons, synthetic hydrocarbon fuels, and the like. You've got the different ways of generating that, the different ways of storing that, and the different ways of using that. In a way, that's the balance that we're trying to do in this system. And I think the thing I found shocking this week is I did a round table and talking about what would happen if we needed to do energy demand reduction. And people, actually, the thing that came out of this round table was people don't understand what role electricity plays in their lives. I thought with the economic crisis and the questions around Russia-Ukraine, people did, and it's apparent that people still don't understand that. And we will be in a changed world by 2050 in terms of that, and it will be mainly renewables with a little bit of hydrogen. There is some residual elements of that, and it will be a fundamental shift from a very carbon-intensive centralised generation and predictable to a low-carbon, more distributed storage. I went to a big, long meeting about storage this afternoon, big data and AI and all those sort of things. So we are moving into a very different world around net zero. So what role for research and innovation, to finish off? What role for research and innovation in this? Having said it's a socio-technical and economic, I'm going to now just kind of give you a techie view of that. This is some wonderful research from the International Energy Authority that said, if you look at it now to 2030, we have 80% of the technologies that we need. So absolutely, with respect to getting to net zero, it's rolling out the technologies at scale that we have this decade that it's important. But if we look at the hardest to decarbonise sectors, out to 2050, there's still a lot of research and innovation that's required. The IEA estimate there's 50% of those technologies that are under development or need to be deployed over those sort of periods of time. For me, as a scientist, thinking about that, I say the net zero transition needs to be sustainable in the way that we meet it, resilient to the pathways that we use, measurable so we know the progress we're making. And I think more and more I'm realising it needs to be deliverable. And that's kind of the engineering challenge that we face in this, the engineering deliverability. We want to decarbonise the power system by 2035. That is actually an engineering deliverability problem. We've got the technologies, it's just rolling them out, and that's the scale. We have some key science challenges. This is my list, and it is included, it's not all the list, hydrogen, CCUS, negative emissions, which we don't really ever talk about, but it's in all the plans, that we're going to have to deliver it. Critical minerals, as we move away from fossil fuel feedstocks to electrification, that changes the footprint around that. Resource and energy efficiency, massively overlooked areas about the way that we use things and the efficiency that we do. Sustainable carbon feedstocks, I'll give you the punchline, there are only two, it's carbon dioxide and methane. The rest of it is not sustainable in one way or the other. And that requires also a lot of energy, so there's some real challenges around that. Agricultural emissions. Should we feed cows seaweed? I don't know. But I mean, it's a very tricky to decarbonise sector around that. This is not just a mitigation problem, it's an adaptation problem. We're going to be thinking about that alongside, and Julia's after, so that's probably the handover to Julia around that. And we've got to think about the behaviour changes and the green choices around that. We have done that in government a little bit. We've put out the Net Zero Research Innovation Framework and a delivery plan for that. It is a systems approach. It's a systems approach to delivering that. It recognises that system for decarbonisation is underpinned by digital, much and often forgotten digital as part of this. It is by finance. I've made that point. It is by good policy. It is by skills, because it's the bingo word. You know, if you don't go to a meeting and say the word skills, you feel cheated in some way around that. But it's also really around that engaged citizens sustainable choices piece as well. So really, research and innovation does lie at the heart of those challenges of the difficult to decarbonise sectors in the future. So for me, some take-homes, net zero is a pervasive problem through everything that we do. It needs a systems approach and court and behaviour change, and research and innovation is critical to delivering the outcomes that we need. I look forward to the debate later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that could be an FST record for the speed at which you've got through so many slides with so much data on them. Now, our third speaker is Baroness Brown. It's great that Julia is joining us, of course, after a distinguished career at Cambridge University at Rolls-Royce. She now chairs the Lord's Science and Technology Committee and was Vice Chair of the Climate Change Committee and Chair of its Adaptation Committee now. Julia, over to you.
So sorry.
So thank you very much. So if Paul thought it was hard following Lord Deben, I've got to follow Lord Deben and Paul, so makes it even harder. But thanks to both of them for doing some wonderful scene setting. So I just want to start by emphasising that issue that Lord Deben was talking about urgency. The weather has been trying to tell us something. Last year in the UK, we had temperatures of 40 centigrade. This empirical data says that maximum temperatures in the southeast of England are rising by something like 1 degree per decade. I find that pretty terrifying. But actually, this year has been, globally at least, even more alarming with this extraordinary month of September that we've just had, 1.75 degrees above pre-industrial against a Paris target of trying to keep below 1.5. And the IMO and Copernicus tell us that 2023 is likely to be 1.4 degrees on average above pre-industrial. And that's when El Nino has barely started. So the El Nino impact next year is likely to be much stronger. So the climate is telling us that we really do need a huge sense of urgency about this. So Paul's told you about this, so that'll make it nice and quick for me. We have the Climate Change Act. We have 6 legislated carbon budgets, which take us out to 2037. We've been coming down that dark blue track, and we've met the first 3 climate budgets. One of them was helped by a certain global financial crash. This most recent one was assisted by COVID. So we've had, you might say we've had a bit of luck, I'll put that in some very big inverted commas, in meeting those carbon budgets. And the dotted yellow line is the government's current indicative path for getting to the next ones, of which I'll say a little more later. Paul very sensibly showed you something about the trends we were seeing up to 2019 in terms of where we were going in terms of emissions. That actually is something I usually show, but I haven't got it this time, so it's jolly useful you showed it, Paul. Because actually, of course, since 2019, we've had COVID. So trends have all gone out of the window. But Paul very, very clearly said to you, the main thing that was driving our emissions reduction up to 2019 was actually decarbonising the electricity system. So if we compare 2021 with 2020, about the only thing we can say is, oh yes, we started being allowed to travel again, and we all took to our cars, and so we saw a big increase in surface transport emissions. And then if we compare 2022 with 2021, we still aren't really picking out much of a trend, except that, of course, you'll notice we were all allowed to fly again, so we see a huge increase in aviation emissions. And you might also notice that even when they're corrected for temperature, and we had a mild winter, we still saw a significant drop in emissions from residential buildings, because, of course, the price of gas had gone up so dramatically with the war in Ukraine. So that's about all you can tell, I think, from that. But it sort of tells you where we are, and we are gradually getting back to a position of stability, I think, when we will be able to look at trends again, and we won't have to keep referring back to 2019. However, we've got to think about how we're going to get to our 2030 goal. And the earlier slide pointed out to you that we've got where we are so far, but actually we've done the easy bit. It gets harder as we go forward. And if you take out aviation and shipping emissions, just because they haven't yet stabilized since COVID and they're kind of all over the place, if you look back 8 years and you look forward 8 years, we've been reducing emissions at about 3% a year. But as we go forward, we've got to increase that to almost 6% a year. And we know if we look backwards, a lot of that has come from decarbonising the electricity system, which has been relatively simple and hasn't had to involve people very much in changing their behaviour, if at all. So if we take out the benefits of taking coal off the system, then we've only been reducing in the rest of the economy by about 1% a year. And what's left going forward for the next 8 years to meet our 2030 goal is that we have to multiply that by about 4. So we've got to be reducing emissions 4 times as fast as we have done in the last 8 years if we're going to meet our 2030 goal. 4 times as fast across key sectors of the economy. And that's going to need a lot of engagement of people, but also a lot of very, very strong focus from government and some very clear and effective policy delivery. So you can see the yellow bar is looking back 8 years, the emissions reduction. The pale blue bar is looking forward. You can see electricity has taken almost all of the load going backwards, but industry needs to more than double its rate of reducing emissions. Surface transport needs to probably about quadruple. And the other thing, buildings and fuel supply, the big emitters, need to pretty much double the rate they've been reducing emissions. And if we think about industry, of course, we're now talking about 7 years, because the data, of course, we have are for 2022. We've got 7 years. Industry takes a long time to make investments to change major processes. We have almost no time at all to get that very significant change in our industrial processes. So Lord Deben mentioned that the government was forced to put out a new plan for reducing its emissions. We had the net zero strategy in 2021, and after the government was taken to court, the court decided it needed to have a strategy where it was clearer where the emissions reductions were at, how the emissions reductions were actually delivered by policy. So beginning of this year, we got the carbon budget delivery plan as a response to that court judgment. And this is a comparison of the net zero strategy with the carbon budget delivery plan. And you'll see there's one really significant difference that's quite important, which is in surface transport. And there are 2 contributors to that. One is that the government realised that the benefits from hybrid vehicles are nothing like as strong as they thought they were going to be. And so the emissions from plug-in hybrids will be significantly greater than was expected. So we should be trying to move to full electric vehicles as quickly as possible. And the other one was the government chose not to take any benefit from a potential reduction in driving. We have actually seen a 5% reduction in driving in kilometres driven since COVID, which at the moment looks as if it might be here to stay, but of course we don't really yet know what the trends look like. The government has chosen not to take any account of that, so the emissions from transport in 2030 in the government's plan will now be significantly higher than they were, and therefore other places are going to have to find significant additional emissions reductions if we're going to get to our target. Well, as Lord Deben said, the Climate Change Committee produced its last assessment, annual assessment under his leadership in the summer, and this is what it said in terms of its assessment of were we going to meet our carbon budgets. The carbon budgets are the purple vertical lines, so there's one in the middle of the first set of coloured boxes, there's one at the bottom that you can't see of this central set, and there's one at the bottom here of this final set for CB6. The thick grey line is our NDC, our 2030 NDC. And what you can see is that the Climate Change Committee said it was now pretty confident we would meet our fourth carbon budget, the one for the middle of the 2020s. A big reason for that actually is this 5% drop in kilometres driven, so a really real benefit in transport. But actually it was less confident, so more red, amber and yellow in terms of lack of credible plans and policy, more amber, red and yellow for both the CB5, which is our NDC, and also for CB6 for the mid-2030s. So a real feeling of anxiety that we are not preparing for the longer term. And if we just look at that through a different lens, which is by sector, then quite a lot of red, amber and yellow for surface transport, an awful lot for buildings, a worrying amount of red for industry, a rather more positive position for electricity supply in terms of how credible the government's policies and plans were at the middle of the year. And I'll come back to that. The Climate Change Committee has a really interesting set of indicators it now uses to see whether we really are making progress against these things. Because you often you need indicators sort of ahead of the game to say are you en route. So this is for some of those sectors the set of indicators it uses, and as you can see, its assessment in June this year was that there are quite a lot of red indicators in every one of those areas. So electric van sales are well behind where we need them to be. And of course, we're all getting more and more deliveries by vans, which means that van kilometres have gone up very significantly in the last few years. So that's a key one. On the heat pumps, not surprisingly, heat pump installations, heat pump cost, skills, trained heat pump. I have to mention skills, don't I, Paul? Trained heat pump installers. So lots of areas where we really are lagging behind, and we do need the government to be focusing on how does it deliver the policy that will improve the situation in those sectors. So, of course, people have mentioned, Lord Deben has mentioned the Prime Minister's speech, and we've had a number of developments since June in the Climate Change Committee's report. So let me just end on that. We've had the pushback of the petrol and diesel phase out from 2030 to 2035. Actually, that sounded terrible, but actually the zero emission mandate for car manufacturers that Lord Deben referred to is unchanged. So that probably won't make very much difference. That was just a very political point. We've had, against buildings, we've had a whole list of delays to when gas boilers need to be phased out from new installations. They're not huge impacts because they're all kind of minority areas, like people who live off grid and have oil or gas from a tank in the garden. So it's not huge numbers of homes. And we have had an increase in the boiler upgrade grant to 7,500, which will be helpful. We've had an announcement in the Prime Minister's speech of fast-tracking grid infrastructure, which is hugely important because, as Paul has mentioned, the scale of electricity infrastructure we're going to need. But of course, we have also had the latest round of contracts for difference auctions where there were no bids for offshore wind, which when we've got a target for 50 gigawatts, sorry, John, of offshore wind by 2030 is a bit unfortunate. We've also, more recently, also had the Port Talbot, the positive announcement of the funding for Tata to take the steelworks at Port Talbot to electric arc furnaces, which will improve the situation from June against industry. So we've had a whole mix of positive and negative announcements, which probably don't make, when you add up the total, a huge amount of difference. They've actually been very political. And actually the Climate Change Committee has a detailed analysis coming out about those tomorrow, being published tomorrow, to tell you exactly how much difference all of these announcements will make. But what they have done is that they have really damaged our international reputation. And Paul talked about the 50 to 60 billion per annum of investment we need. That's not investment we've got in this country. That's investment we need people to bring in to help us build this new electricity system. And those investors overseas now think that we're backtracking on our commitments. And that has been really damaging to UK's reputation. And I think that may be one of the most damaging things and is probably an unintended consequence of the Prime Minister's speech. So that is what I am really worried about. But I cannot leave you without saying mitigation is critical, but the temperature is going to go on rising at best for the next 30 years. So mitigation alone is not enough, and we need to adapt as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. Now we have our fourth and final speaker, and Professor Jim Skea has spoken before here at the FST. He was a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change from its creation in 2008 until 2018. He was the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. But of course, we're particularly pleased he's with us this evening because back in July, he was elected as IPCC chair for the 7th assessment cycle. So it's very good of you to join us, Professor Skea. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, David. And just to say, one of the challenges I have in my new job is that I'm expressly forbidden from commenting on the policies of any of the 195 countries that make up IPCC. So I have to fulfill that mandate while at the same time trying to be interesting. This is a challenge. Right, so what I'm going to do is try to distill some of the IPCC's global messages, and I will do it under 3 headings, and there's an acronym for these headings, which is UAE. And this is not the location of COP28. It stands for urgency, agency, and equity. And these are the 3 headings I will pursue. So first of all, on the urgency side, it's very evident, as previous speakers have said, climate change is already on us. It's unequivocal that human beings are the cause of the climate change we see. And I think it's been very helpful that Julia has set out the just exceptional kind of climate events that we've seen during 2023. On the emissions side, at global level, we have bent the upward trend in emissions, but we have yet to get onto a downward path, and certainly not the steep downward path that we need to get to net zero. And unless we get to net zero, global temperatures will continue to rise because of the cumulative nature of emissions. If we do go beyond 1.5 degrees, there are new risks that are going to emerge at the global level. Permafrost degradation, water scarcity in dryland areas, more extreme weather events, worse than we've seen already, and potential damage to the productivity of food systems. And we mustn't forget that sea level rise, which is almost inevitable, is an existential threat for small island states and low-lying coastal areas. So without immediate ambitious action, there are threats to planetary health and human systems. Now that is a message of despair if we're not very careful about that. And one of the things that we've been very clear about in messaging is that we should not have a sense of paralysis or lack of agency induced by these kind of things, because we do have agency over our future. We do have the tools available, and if we exercise them, we can avoid the worst impacts. And we have indeed started to make progress globally in terms of renewable energy, wind and solar, and I think has already been said, China has some of the biggest investments in all of these. We've got electrification starting to move out, and again, the biggest deployment of electric vehicles globally is in fact in China. But one thing I would want to flag, there is a concentration of these successes in China, North America, and Europe. And there is a need to spread that more widely geographically, especially for developing countries, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where actually we need much more investment in infrastructure to enable the rollout of renewable energy. Also flag up that we've got significant progress in terms of land-based measures, especially reforestation and avoided deforestation, where in Asia and in South America we are seeing significant progress. Also flag out on the softer side, we also have all the policy tools available to help us move forward. More than 50% of global emissions are actually covered by climate laws, policies, and institutions, and about a fifth of global emissions are covered by some kind of carbon pricing. So we have the tools available. There is also enough money in the world to deal with the challenge of climate change, even though there are trillions of dollars involved at the international level. If we can pull the levers and start to get private sector funding in to supplement funds from the public sector. So that's the summing up on agency. We've got the technologies, we've got the know-how, we've got the money. We just need to put them to use. But I would caution also from Julia's talk that in a sense we've started on the easy bits. I know it's a major engineering challenge to get a 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm going, but in my view it's the easy bit. The difficult bit is going to come with the measures that involve changes to people's lives, that touch their lives more directly. So the future challenges around transport, housing, potentially dietary issues are all ones that are going to be much more difficult. So that brings me to the final point, the E in the UAE acronym, which is equity. And why should we be concerned about equity? Well, there's a principled reason for doing it. It's just the right thing to do. But there's also a pragmatic reason, because unless the climate action we take is perceived to be fair, we will not get the consent that is available to allow the transition to take place. People are affected by climate action and what actions that are taking, not just the physical impacts of climate change. So there are two dimensions, I think, to equity. One is the global perspective, equity between the global south and the global north. And one thing that we did in the last IPCC report was carefully set out the facts on cumulative historical emissions of greenhouse gases, and also the wide variation in per capita emissions across different parts of the world. And it sends out very powerful messages that those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are those who contribute least to the problem. And that is why within the Paris Agreement, recalling the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement, which are the long-term temperature goal, which takes us to emissions reduction, but also the goals on adaptation and finance are absolutely critical for building consensus. They're interlocking goals, and we cannot achieve where we want to go without taking account of the whole package. So the symbolic value of commitments like the $100 billion from developed countries is incredibly important. Loss and damage will come up as an issue at COP28 again in a big way. The question of what happens when we go beyond the limits of adaptation and face residual risks. Now, there's another dimension to equity, which is the national and subnational perspectives. There are obviously big economic opportunities associated with a low carbon agenda, but also risks for those in declining sectors and the communities that host these economic activities. There are also impacts on consumers. A feature of the low carbon transition is that it's capital intensive. You may lower costs in the long term, but you need to put money up front to make it happen. And the ability to pay for these upfront costs and who's going to pay for it will be absolutely critical. So both at the more national and subnational level, the just transition aspects, what in terms of both supply, employers, employees, and also consumers is important. So just transition is a prerequisite for consent and to make it effective. I might remind Lord Deben that I came to speak to the Climate Change Committee about just transition. And I think you shamelessly said, Lord Deben, I'll steal all the ideas from Scotland, but I won't use the phrase. I think that's what you there. So you were very welcome to the ideas there. Now, I'm just going to finish off, but maybe I'm not supposed to talk about individual countries, but let me just give you a couple of messages, and it's up to you to infer whether this has significance in the UK. I'm not actually going to say it. So the first thing is about net zero. It's not about when you get to net zero. It's the cumulative emissions that you have on the pathway to net zero. So the pathway matters, and delayed action means the world will be warmer than it otherwise would have been. And I think that's a very important message to remember. Second message on fossil fuels, a very clear message in the last report that the reserves of fossil fuels in the ground would exceed the carbon budgets for the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement if they were all burned. And the numbers that were mentioned were 80% of coal, 50% of oil, and 30% of gas of current reserves would need to stay in the ground to limit warming to 2 degrees. Very stark numbers. So any addition to reserves that we make at the moment just creates more acute problems for future policymakers who may have to choose between the economic revenues that they get from burning the fuels versus actually meeting the Paris targets. So I hope I haven't strayed into UK domestic policy there at all, but I'll just leave it with a couple of final messages. Urgency, we are in a difficult and dangerous place, but we are not helpless. We have the agency to actually pursue action. And finally, paying attention to equity is absolutely essential if we're going to build the consent around ambitious climate action. And I'll finish it there.
Good. Well, 4 excellent presentations with both a UK and a global perspective. And we've got a few minutes. I've also had some questions coming in from Zoom, but let me begin by a first opportunity for the people physically here in the room to make some points. So I'll collect some interventions from the front. Yeah, we'll collect a group. Oh, we'll collect 4 or 5 from the front. And all the panelists aren't obliged to answer every question. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your excellent presentations. My name's Emily Faint, and I'm the Net Zero Policy Lead at the British Standards Institution. And I look in particular in my role at the role of international standards in net zero, and namely that there isn't one. I would be curious for any of the panelists who can comment on this, what you see as the role of regulation in delivering some of the emissions reductions that you have so aptly pointed out. What is the balance between voluntary action and the role of mandatory regulation to help us reach those targets? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's stick towards the front. Yes, across there.
Ian Conn, Chairman of Engineering UK. An observation, a couple of bits of evidence, and then leave you with a question. And I want to focus on the global, not the UK, but the observation is, as Jim said, we're focusing on what we can, but we're not solving the global problem. And the evidence is the UK is less than 0.7% of greenhouse gas emissions. We are spending $1.1 trillion a year on the energy transition, but nearly all of it is on electric vehicles and renewable generation. What it isn't on are the really big problems, as some of you have said. And unabated coal in Asia, for example, is 10 billion tons of greenhouse gases, and global emissions are 50. And if we can't solve unabated coal in Asia, we can't solve climate change. And then, I'm not trying to criticize Jim, but the G195 is all we've got. But G2 is 36% of emissions, and G5 is 50% of emissions, and G10 is 60. So how can we mobilize, this is my question, how can we mobilize to focus on the materiality of impact globally as opposed to just doing what we can?
Right, thank you very much. Let's keep on close by. Yes, there's a lady. Yep, there we are. And then we'll try to do that table. Yep.
Hi, thanks very much. Amy Booth from the University of Oxford. I think just firstly, thanks for your honesty, I think, about the challenges that are involved in this space. I want to bring up outsourced emissions quickly and wonder whether you have any comments on those. So obviously, you've spoken quite a lot about the UK's net zero plans, but that doesn't include a lot of the emissions that are outsourced to other countries. And obviously, we need to bear in mind the global perspective here because we are one planet. But what are your thoughts, especially in relation to, Jim, what you said at the end about equity, in really dealing with some of these outsourced emissions? Thanks.
Thank you. And I think there was a couple of other questions at that table, and then we will pause. Yep.
Thank you. Peter Bonfield, University of Westminster. My first question is, by now, if we'd kept with the Code for Sustainable Homes, linking to the standards point, we'd have built more than 1 million homes that are zero net carbon, where energy bills are measured in tens of pounds rather than £1,000. Won't scope for bringing something like that back. Second question is around the quality of what's being done. I did a review on energy efficiency and green technology measures and found systemic failure. So how are we doing on quality of delivery? I also did a review on property level resilience, so that when properties are flooded, they're rebuilt. And my fourth point actually is one about offsetting. At the end, we'll have to offset. And I worked on the Olympics, and one of the things we did there was we didn't build a big windmill, which would look great because the wind resource would never generate the carbon savings. Instead, we took the money we would have put into the windmill and invested in energy efficiency measures in local schools, so they had the money to employ special needs teachers and others. So what scope for building some offsetting fund that delivers a carbon savings and societal benefits alongside?
Right, and I think there's one other question on this table, and then we will go to the panel. Yes, towards here, yeah.
Hi, Sylvia from UCL. Thank you so much for your insights. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on how you think current geopolitical tensions might actually also impact current net zero targets and future ones as well.
Thank you. Now, Jim, I'm going to start with you, if I may, especially on some of those more international questions, standards, for example. Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe if I can start with the UK as 0.7% of emissions or whatever. I mean, one of the points that was made actually in the previous set of IPCC reports in the 5th cycle is that climate change is a global commons problem. It's not for individual countries. Unless we show solidarity between countries, the problem will not be solved. So the UK has to be part of the solution. And I do get, because I'm so exposed to the discussions with other countries, I'm very sensitive to the fact that we should not look at other countries' efforts always through our own lens. The efforts that have been made in China are, for example, are very, very considerable. The Indian situation is interesting, and I have to say all the discussions with the Indian government are about that global equity issue, because India has very, very low per capita emissions. I would say about India, they've made huge progress in terms of reforestation and managing their forests, which is making a big, big difference. And obviously what they are looking for in phasing out unabated coal, and the word unabated is very important, is the question of technology transfer and aid to do that. So I'm very wary of just saying, well, we're only 0.7%, so we're not material. If everybody says that, we're stuffed, quite frankly. We need to work collectively. There was a point about consumption-based emissions, and just to say in IPCC, we report these as well as territorial emissions. One point I would flag is that the amount of carbon embodied in trade has actually been coming down, partly because of reduced levels of global trade, but also because in China, for example, big exporting country, we've seen big improvements in efficiency. You're there. So it's, the gap is narrowing, I think, in difference between consumption and territorial emissions. And the final point on geopolitical tensions, begins to take me into areas I can't talk about, but let me just say again, always a but, one of the very strong conclusions that a world in which we pursue net zero is a world in which there is less trade in energy and people are more reliant on their own resources. And that is unambiguously the case if you, for example, make greater use of renewable energy.
Very much. And of course, on the small fraction of current consumption, for those of a historical, conservative perhaps disposition, as I think IPCC showed, the amount of carbon dioxide behind the living standards currently achieved in Britain that has historically been used to get us to this position is, I think, it makes us the most carbon, the greatest carbon emission historically behind each one of us as British citizens, I think, than of any other country. The US is now getting close, of course. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. A few brief comments. On the standards piece, I think international standards is essential. I think Britain has an interesting place to play in that because actually we are standard setters, and I think there's economic opportunity in standard setting around that. I'm going to dodge the mandation question slightly around standards because I think the way to actually do it in global is to have that equity position again and start and work together with people rather than mandating outcomes. On the unabated coal in Asia, I mean, as part of COP26, the UK government led something called the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which really pushed for removal of unabated coal. I can't remember the number, Jim, but it's something like 70-odd% committed. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's significantly over 50 committed to the removal of unabated coal. So I think there's progress on that. But again, as Jim said, and we work through Mission Innovation 2.0 in order to work with countries around the technologies that you need in order to replace those. And I'll skip to the very last one as well. As Jim said, I think one of the things that we need to talk about a little bit with respect to geopolitical tensions is energy security. I come from a department that's now called Energy Security and Net Zero. In a way, energy security and net zero are different sides of the same coin in that sense. But I think the geopolitical tensions has made people think about indigenous energy generation. And that can only be good for the decarbonisation agenda because much of that leads you down the pathway of renewables. So I think there are a number of areas around that which I think are quite interesting. I'll stop there, David.
Thank you, Paul. Julia?
Yes, for me to start with standards, clearly hugely important. Here we are desperately in need of some good standards for green hydrogen that are consistent across different places. There are 101 different things that people are calling sustainable aviation fuel. We really could do with being clear on that. We've also now got what do we call lower carbon steels? And we can't call them low carbon steels because that's actually a type of steel. But these reduced carbon intensity steels, you can slightly reduce the carbon intensity of steel making by changing the carbon intensity of the electricity you use in the process. You can move to electric arc furnaces. You could move to using hydrogen as a reducing agent. These are going to produce steels with very different carbon intensities. We don't at the moment have a way of labeling or describing them that's agreed, and yet we've got people trying to make plans, the manufacturing industry trying to make plans that includes these steels. So we are, in desperate need of lots of international agreements on standards which would help us move some of these things forward. In terms of regulation, I think one of the things that I see making quite a big difference is reporting, making large companies, listed companies, report under the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure on their risk, both their risk in terms of reducing emissions, but also their physical risk. But that is getting people very focused on their supply chains. And I see that bringing industry groups together to work with their supply chains and in areas that are non-competitive. When our group of an industry group all need, for example, a low carbon steel, bringing them together to work to support their supply chain to actually be able to deliver what they need, I think is turning out to be, quite a positive move, and we need to see much more of that. Somebody was talking about property level flood resilience. It was really great to hear that mentioned. We need to get to a position where insurers actually recognise the value, and that probably needs some standards there, recognise the values of property level flood resilience measures, so that they can start reducing the cost to the homeowner of insuring their home if they live in a flood prone area. So that's hugely important. On the Adaptation Committee, when we try and look at progress in the UK on the implementation of property level flood resilience, it's actually very difficult to get the data. And that's the kind of data we should really be collecting in the UK, and it's data that the insurance industry should be very interested in indeed. And of course, in terms of geopolitical tensions, one of the geopolitical tensions we're storing up for ourselves for the future, as the climate change, is of course the issue of increased migration and more refugees as places become much harder to live in. Yeah. And that is going to cause, if we're not careful, real geopolitical tensions in the future, let alone the ones we have now.
Thank you, Julia. John?
Well, first on regulation, I'm a great believer in regulation, although I'm also a believer in good regulation. And I think that the concept of regulation is going to be increasingly important, because people who are in particularly manufacturing want a fair platform. They want to have a fair dues. And what is interesting is that that is one of the things that the chairman of Ford was asking for, but it's one of the things that this very day at the Labour Party conference, two of our biggest retailers were saying, we do want to have action on obesity, and we want the regulations, because that enables us to do things which we couldn't otherwise do, because we are undermined constantly by those who do not have the same standards. So I think regulation is a crucial part of this. And regulation can only work if you have proper international standards, so that you are actually applying the same things across the bucket. But it's also important to accept that we need information, because the thing that worries me about both major political parties in Britain is that they're always terrified of being the nanny state. There's a fundamental difference between a nanny state and a state which gives individuals the information they need to make proper decisions. My political life is built on the concept that I want people to decide, but they can't decide if you don't give them the proper information, which is why greenwashing is so damaging. It's damaging because it makes people unable to make a proper choice. Good labelling as well as regulation, and that means the regulation to make sure that the labelling is actually true, is crucially important. And I think if we move in that direction, you also begin to bring people in with you. And my last point, which came from someone, but I think it was the question of the housing. Let's realise we built 1.5 million homes which are not fit for the future. This is what happens when you go back on your measures. Those 1.5 million homes have meant that the house builders have taken the profit and handed the cost on to the people they have sold the houses to. It is one of the great scandals of our time. And if I were in the government, I would be insisting that there would be a windfall tax on all house builders who have built more than 100 houses, and that tax would go on for 5 years, and there would be a fund then which those who have bought their houses could call upon in order to make their houses fit for the future. It is a scandal that Persimmon has sold hundreds of thousands of houses which are not fit for the future. and they ought to be ashamed of themselves. They happen to be the worst of them, or have been historically.
Thank you, John. Whenever I hear you say, if I were in the government, I can almost sense the frisson of anxiety coming across from Westminster. Yeah. Right. Now, we've got some online interventions, and let me just go through some of those for our online participants. We've got a question from Barbara Young, which is very topical. I might, to save time, I might turn particularly to Julia on this one. The grid is already failing the task of supporting net zero. How should it be fixed? And we've indeed had an entire FST conference last year on the challenge of the grid. Then there is an interesting question from Steve Yanni. Do we need to talk more of developing markets to support net zero rather than developing technologies? Strong market demand can pull through technology solutions. And then thirdly, and this has been upvoted, it may strike a chord, don't we also have to focus more on our own personal behaviour in terms of energy consumption, asks David Wallace. So Julia, you first, especially that grid question.
Well, I think we've heard the grid is going to have to grow enormously fast, and it's going to have to change quite radically from its form now to a grid that can cope with almost a predominantly renewable energy system that's twice the size. So I think we've had the report from Nick Windsor, the Electricity System Commissioner on the Infrastructure Commission, which the government has, which is saying we are going to need some special approaches to planning for bringing in the new energy infrastructure that we're going to need. And actually, at a recent meeting I was at, Chris Stark, the chief executive of the Climate Change Committee, pulled out some magnificent advertisements from the 1960s when we were also having a large expansion of the energy system, and they were in Country Life, and they were talking to people about the sort of pylons that would be needed. They were engaging with the public to say, we're going to need to do this, here are the benefits you're going to have of this new electricity system we're building, but these are the things we're going to do. Tell us what you think. They were actually, and we need, alongside the kind of changes to planning that Nick Windsor was wanting, and the acceleration of investment ahead of need for our distribution network and things, we need this engagement with the public. Otherwise, we're going to have the public saying, we don't want these hideous things walking across our beautiful fields and things. And that's needed really urgently. And, it was interesting to see that we have done it before in the 1960s, and we need to be turning on those sorts of approaches again.
Paul, you wanted to comment
I think
on that?
coming on the grid in the Nick Windsor report, I saw one of those adverts today, actually, Julian, and it had a pylon with a lady sitting on top of a washing machine. So I'm not sure all the adverts were pretty good in the 1950s around that.
Brilliant.
No, but I think what you're saying is right. I mean, we actually need to build 4 times the amount of transmission that we've built actually every year for the next 7 years, and we've built since 1990. I think what's very good about the Nick Windsor report is the spatial planning piece, the holistic network design piece as well, and we need to absolutely address the planning law type questions as well, because it will be a bottleneck for the decarbonisation around that. And I think when we talk about that, we're not just talking about building technology, which another question is about. It's about planning, it's about regulatory reform, it's about holistic approach to these sort of things. I think it's also, as you said, and I want to support this idea of reducing community impacts and talking to communities about the impacts of infrastructure as well, and community consultation as part of that, so that people understand what they're getting. But there's also a role for innovation. There are new wires. I saw today, if you change the top of the pylons that we have from metal to plastic, you can actually increase the amount of power that you put down the current grid that we've got. So there is innovation in there that can help make the grid that we've got more efficient as part of that as well.
Thank you very much. Jim?
Yeah, I'll pick up the second and third ones. On developing markets, of course, markets are going to help us move towards ambitious climate action, but they're not going to be enough in themselves. I'll just flag up that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement introduces the dreadful acronym of ITMOs, Internationally Transferable Mitigation Options, which is a market-based device which will have the value of providing the capacity to shift finance from richer countries for people with the money to the places where the projects can actually be put in place. But just let me emphasize, it's not enough by itself. There'll need to be progress on technology. Initiatives like mission innovation, transfer of technologies will build up trust among developing countries. It's all incredibly important. On personal behaviour, for the first time in the last IPCC report, we had a whole chapter on consumption and individual behaviour. It was part of the campaign to actually put a human being on the cover photograph, which was the first time ever in an IPCC report that people were actually part of the picture. But the strong message that came there, it is not just about individual choice. That does not do it by itself. People make their choices in a context that's set by the infrastructure, the kind of planned environments in which they live, the availability of technology. So very obviously you can choose an electric vehicle, but you need the charging infrastructure, you need the vehicle. You need to live in homes that are fit for the future, I may say, John, as well. It's really important. So people's personal choices are enabled by the environment in which they work. So it isn't all just a case of turning down the thermostat or switching off the light. You need to have the right kind of environment and context in which people make these choices.
Thank you very much. And John? Yeah.
Well, you need the light to go off automatically when you leave the room. You want to make things easier when you do the right thing, and more difficult and more expensive to do the wrong thing. But you must not ignore the importance of each one of us doing what we ought to do, not only because it adds up, but also because we don't have a right to ask other people to do things, it seems to me, unless we do the thing properly ourselves. I had a major argument with Lady Bennett, the Green peer, on this subject. She said she didn't mind what people did. It was all systemic change. I'm sorry, it isn't. It's both systemic change and what people do. And you have to set an example, which is why I'm so disappointed about where the government itself is on these issues. As far as the other issues are concerned, I really come on the grid. Of course, it is the grid. But three things we shouldn't forget. One is we've got a wrong measure of costing it. So for all sorts of reasons, we don't put in the cost of doing something which is going to be very difficult in planning terms and through the courts and the rest of it. We really do have to have undersea cables where that's sensible, and not actually have a system which doesn't allow you to cooperate to do that. That's the sort of thing you have to. There are also small things which can be done. I declare an interest because we've just been doing some work in my business in Sancroft on the issue of using, when you're balancing the grid, using batteries. There's a very considerable opportunity to use batteries. And as batteries have in fact been fired up by energy when we've got too much wind or too much sun, they are one of the best things to reduce our emissions. Unfortunately, there are all sorts of things in the system which makes it easier for the people who are balancing the grid to press the button for setting up the gas supplies. Now, the gas, you have to put it on for 6 hours if you use it at all. And that really is a huge mistake. If you only use the batteries, which will take some time to get to it, you really do make another big step in decarbonisation. So the thing I would pray for is that we look at the small things, or what seem to be the small things, as well as the big ones. Everyone has accepted we've got to get the grid right as a whole, but we've also got to use things as a whole. So I finish by saying one of the things we should be doing is using less. That is why I find successive governments even coalition governments, not recognizing that energy efficiency is absolutely central. It's the cheapest way to do things about this. And I really find it very hard to understand why politicians seem to think there is something wicked about energy efficiency. It doesn't seem to get votes, I think, is the answer. I want much more energy efficiency. If we get that, we can make a huge difference.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, let's have another round of questions. There's a lot of questions. We've got another quarter of an hour, and I'm going to ask people to exercise a very delicate ethical judgment, because some people here will be coming down to dinner, and we will have a second opportunity over the dinner break to carry on questioning. There'll be some people who may be leaving and not staying for dinner. So are there people who particularly are not going to be around during dinner, for whom this is their one chance of asking a question? Oh, everybody's staying for dinner, right? Okay, all right. Oh, so these are people, right? So we'll now just do a normal. I don't think there was anybody there who said they were not staying for dinner, right?
Hello, Richard Barker from MPO. I think the Committee for Climate Change and the inventory team in Paul's department do a fabulous job for what I think is peanuts money when you think about the 50 to 60 billion a year that we need to spend. But when I talk to stakeholders, there's still a desperate need for information that they don't have. For instance, when I talk to metropolitan authorities, they try and do initiatives and they don't know whether it works. So the question for me is, how do we fix this lack of information that's needed at all levels of society?
Right, thank you. Let's collect some more. Let's head towards the back this time. Okay, there's a hand right there. Yeah, that's nearest, and then we'll go back. Yeah.
Thank you. Just drawing together a couple of really good themes that have been, and with two Conservative parliamentarians here, in defence of Rishi Sunak, he highlighted the importance of innovation, and picking up Professor Monks's point, innovation is absolutely critical to getting to net zero. And it's an area where the UK can really make a big difference. So there was a question about what can the UK do? It's only 0.7. We can make a big difference globally in innovation, and with systems like next generation power, space-based solar power, for example, which can really make a difference globally. And I wondered what the panel thought of the importance of putting more emphasis on next generation technologies.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then across the lady there, yeah.
Hello, I'm Fanula Costello from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And just building on that point on innovation, I'm the Programme Director for the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. It's £1 billion. We've funded 550 projects. We've done a lot of feasibility studies, front-end engineering design. Now we're doing the hard bit, which is demonstrators. And what we're finding is, we've talked about it already, planning permission is tricky, supply chain, getting hold of electrolyzers, compressors, that's difficult. But also getting companies to make those investment decisions. And we're going to need a lot more investment, private investment, to make this transition happen. So what can we do to make those human beings who are making those decisions, those corporate decisions, to make more green? Because the potential growth for that industry, the green industry, should be 4 times faster than the rest of the economy, but it's not translating at the moment into those commercial decisions.
Thank you very much. Very powerful challenge there. And then let's head to the gentleman right at the back there who's got his arm up. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Ehsan Masood from Nature. Just circling back to Lord Deben, to your observation at the very start, that, and just to add to it, really, there's a narrative within the political class that decarbonisation or getting to net zero is or harms the interests of poor people, of people on low incomes. And I'm guessing that's going to be a narrative that will be built on during the election campaign. What is the panel's expert view on this question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's go through those questions. And if I may exercise chairman's prerogative, wearing my other hat as chair of the Resolution Foundation, I think that it would be good in this round of answers to comment on the economics and the issues in in living standards. I mean, the UK has got to make an investment of 1.3, 1.4 trillion. The good news is that that yields operational savings and efficiency gains of worth 1.1 trillion. But the people who enjoy the benefits of those 1.1 billion savings are not necessarily the same as the people who incur the costs. So there is, as well as technology and science and human behavior, there is some economics as well. And John, you wrestle with all this, your observations on that and the other questions.
Well, you do have to face up to the fact that you have to have government intervention to make this a just transition. I have no disagreement with that. And one of the problems that we've got is that we can show how cheap it is to make the changes we need and how much we gain from that. It's really enormous. We can do it for less than 1% of our GNP, and the result as far as our GNP is enormous. It's really remarkable. But there are people who get caught in between, and government has simply got to face that, and they have got to use the forces of government in order to make it possible for people to accept those changes. And there is no argument out of that. You have to do it. It is government intervention. People don't like it, but it's the way that we have to deal with those matters. The issue about information is absolutely part of that, because it's not just information for great companies and the like. It's also the fact that I wanted an air source heat pump. I was chairman of the Climate Change Committee. I had access to all the information you could possibly want. I can't tell you how hard it was to find somebody who was capable of doing it, would do it properly, and wouldn't be a cowboy. How do you do that? Now, if I can't do that, what about Mrs. Miggins? What does she do? She says, I want to do the right thing, but she can't get the information. I think the information is part of that whole business about the just transition, that you actually got to help people do that. And the just transition, for example, on homes can be done. There's a huge amount of money in the private sector already to help people borrow money when they can, in fact, pay it back slowly, borrow money to make the changes they need and to save on their energy if they do it. The fact is the government's got to stand behind that. It's got to be a system which you can tie to the house, so that when you sell the house, it's rather like it'll pass on to the person afterwards who pays for that, because that is how you get a very low interest rate system. You can do all that. And I think if you put those together, you begin to have the sort of just transition that you need. And I just repeat Jim's point. If you don't have a just transition, we won't have a transition at all, because the public will not bear it. And anyway, why should they? And already we've shown nonsense. Why have we put the green tax on electricity and not on gas, when that means that 20% of the country that doesn't have gas, very much among the poorest, they are the people who are paying the largest proportion of that, or they were. Now we've put it back on, but we haven't put it across the whole of the energy system. It is just boringly, badly organized, and we need to get that right.
There are so many examples of that. The charging points, the public charging points costing more than if you've got a drive or an access to a domestic charging overnight. But you did talk about this, and you had just an equity, as your equity is one of your themes. And of course, perhaps even and we understand the constraints of your current role, but reflections on your experience planning just transition in Scotland.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I stepped down as chair of the Just Transition just a couple of weeks ago, but this was a central issue that we were addressing. And really, you do need to break it down into parts, because it's different in the social housing sector, private rented sector, and for owner-occupiers. And you need to tailor the responses to the different parts of the market. So in Scotland, there was actually huge progress in terms of social housing, which was moving forward very quickly. Though just to flag a little risk, it is having a noticeable effect on social housing rents as well. So it can come back to hit you. With private renting, there are obvious intervention points when tenancies change. That's an obvious way into it. But the biggest challenge in a way is owner-occupiers, where you have to look at, these people can afford it, and they shouldn't be getting the benefit of public subsidies when they're reaping all the benefits in the future, where I think is where the question of innovative financing packages, loans, that side of it comes into play. So it's an extremely complicated picture, and you do need to look at the granularity, but there are ways of approaching it that do take account of the equity aspects.
Thank you very much. Paul, would you particularly want to focus on the sort of technology innovation question and also the business investment and opportunity issue?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just add something to the information sort of angle as well, just in passing. I do think there's a need for trusted voices in there. You know, I mean, Ronald Reagan famously said the most fearsome phrase in the British language is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." But I think that shows a mistrust, I think, of the government. And I would say, I'm a great fan of some organisations that can help, particularly at the local level, be a trusted voice around decarbonisation and give practical solutions as well, and allow some of these issues around heat pump installation to work as well. So I think that trusted voice piece and information is important. I think the obvious question about making that information digestible and ready for the public as well, and no gigawatts or terawatt hours in there whatsoever, obviously. I think on the innovation stuff, at the moment I'm reading Mark Z. Jacobson's book, which his argument is we have all the technology we need, you can do everything with wind, water and solar. I've read the beginning of the book and I've read the end of the book, which is probably not the best thing to do. I still can't quite get his arguments to add up. So for me, I'm a maximal technology person. I think you've got to deploy all the technologies that you have. You've got to throw the whole kitchen sink, if you will, the proverbial kitchen sink at net zero. I think the Climate Change Committee has put a warning out on that, which I think is a really good one, actually, which said you've got to be careful if you're keeping optionality open that you're not increasing cost. So I think that's something that's got to be thought about in this kind of maximal technology place, if you will, around that. On space-based solar power at 8:30 this Monday morning, I was there talking on the European Space Agency webinar about that. I think it's great. I think the British have really great technologies in this area. We've got innovative companies that are looking to do with it. When somebody first said to me, we're going to produce gigawatts, of power from space, I thought, what a completely bonkers idea is that? Who came up with that? Big floating mirrors in space. And actually, the more that you look at it, you go, actually, it kind of works. And for me as well, for something like space-based solar power, the spillover benefits that you get, robotic assembly in space, wireless transmission, they're the sort of things we can use with the islands of the Pacific, who it's cheaper not to put a cable in, actually to do wireless transmission. So for me, the benefits of being at the vanguard of something like that technology, space-based solar power, will allow different decarbonisation solutions, which will drive and have the potential to be part of that equitable and fair transition.
And just to clarify, as a layman, we're not talking about a James Bond laser. We're talking about intense radio waves, I think.
Microwaves, to be correct, David. There are laser-based solutions available, I believe.
Yeah, just don't fly near them. Julia, yes, over to you.
Because I did just worry a bit about perhaps the tone of the question about innovation and space-based solar power, which is which was that feeling that better solutions are coming along, so we should wait. And the one thing we can't afford to do now is wait. We have 80% of what we need to solve the problem. We've got to get on with that 80%. Yes, we've got to invest in what we're going to need next, but thinking something better is coming along is not a reason for not acting now, because as Jim reminded us, actually its emissions now are more of a problem than emissions later. So it's the cumulative emissions. So hockey sticks are not a good idea. We've got to act now. We've got to get that 4 times the speed of emissions reduction in the UK in the next 8 years that we've had in the last 8 years. And so space-based solar power, great. Let's invest in that for the future, but let's not think that solves the problem we've got to address today.
Could I just say the thing that worries me is that politicians use innovation as an excuse for not doing things now. That's why I'm very suspicious of that argument. I'm hugely in favour of innovation, but I remember a friend of mine and the laptop. He wouldn't buy this laptop because there was a new one coming which was going to be better, And then when that came, he heard of another one that was going to come, and that was going to be better. And in the end, he was behind everybody when he finally bought a laptop. And it seems to me that you've got to be very careful about innovation as being the excuse for no action. And politicians in general, I apologize for being a former politician, politicians in general like to have excuses for not having to do something now. And innovation can easily become that.
I think we are getting to an end. Of course, there'll be time to carry on over dinner. I think, Jim, I might just ask you for your reflections on it, because we are gathered in the Royal Society. This is the Foundation for Science and Technology. There's a strand of opinion that one of the good news stories is that technology is moving faster, that innovation is going to save us. But we have been warned about the dangers of delay. How do you assess that trade-off?
Well, I mean, just to say, I think the evidence from the last IPCC reports is that we have the technologies we need for action up the next sort of 10 years, up to say 2040. We can make huge progress with what we have got already. But of course, we're investing for the future, for the second half of the 21st century as well. But I think it needs a very careful appraisal about what kind of innovation we need, because people are already, talking about the role of hydrogen, for example, for steel production. There are many areas in which there is kind of incremental, it's engineering, problem-solving kind of progress that is needed to take us in the right direction. And perhaps, the issues around, space solar is taking into these more speculative and breakthroughs. We do need a kind of portfolio for the future that covers what we've got already, what is foreseeable and what can be delivered through engineering solving problem, and what is more in the character of breakthrough technologies. So I think you do need a portfolio approach to deal with it. And I guess, long-term R&D provides potential options for the future. 90% of it might not work, but if it's minimal cost at the beginning, it's worthwhile doing.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We will now adjourn and convene downstairs for dinner at 8 o'clock. I will bid farewell to our online participants. I'm sorry we weren't able to get all of the online questions in, but we got some of them in, and we are grateful to people who have participated online. But above all, thank you to a wonderful panel of 4 formidable presentations and excellent answers to questions. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.